October 1964, a state dacha in Pitsunda, on the shores of the gentle Black Sea. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and head of the Soviet state, the man who banged his shoe on the podium at the UN and promised to show the Americans Kuzka's mother, is enjoying the last warm days. He is confident in his power and in his comrades in arms. The absurdity of the situation was that while he was breathing in the sea air in quiet Moscow offices, his closest associates had already passed judgment on him. No one was preparing an assault or arrests. A quiet, almost cabinet-level coup was being prepared. Dissatisfaction with Khrushchev had been brewing for more than a month, slowly accumulating like water in a cracked dam. The party elite, the nomenclature that he himself had nurtured, was tired of his unpredictability. The main accusation that hung in the air was the word voluntarism, as they called it in those days, making decisions based solely on one's own desires, without taking into account the opinion of the collective and objective reality. Khrushchev was a man of extremes. He could get fired up about an idea and, without listening to experts, start implementing it across the country. The most striking example was the infamous corn campaign. Seeing the high yields of this crop in the United States, Nikita Sergeyevich decided that corn was a panacea for Soviet agriculture. The queen of the fields was ordered to be sown everywhere, from the black soil of Ukraine to the cold lands of the Arkhangelsk region, and even in Yakutia. The result was predictable. Where conditions were not suitable for corn, it did not grow, and traditional centuries-old grain crops, for which the sowing area had been reduced, yielded a smaller harvest. This, coupled with other ill-conceived agricultural reforms, led to a serious bread shortage in the country by 1963. For the first time in history, the Soviet Union, an agricultural superpower, was forced to buy grain for gold from its ideological opponent, the United States. For many party officials and ordinary citizens, this was a national humiliation. Another source of irritation was his administrative reform. In 1962, Khrushchev divided party committees into industrial and rural ones. This created incredible confusion, dual power at the local level, and disrupted the usual vertical structure of management. Officials, accustomed to stability and a clear hierarchy, found themselves in limbo. Their careers, their positions, their futures, everything depended on the leader's next impulsive decision. The elite wanted calm and predictability, but Khrushchev gave them constant upheaval. In this atmosphere of general fatigue and dull irritation, a circle of conspirators began to form. This was not a group of people with daggers under their cloaks. These were his closest associates. The central figure around whom everyone united was Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. He was the complete opposite of Khrushchev, calm, judicious, a good listener, and not prone to making rash decisions. He seemed the ideal figure to restore Leninist norms of party life and stability. Other influential figures stood alongside him. For example, Alexander Shelepin, former head of the Komsomol and then the Committee for State Security, an ambitious and energetic politician who was nicknamed Iron Shurik behind his back. His protege, acting KGB chairman Vladimir Semichastny, also played a key role. Their cautious conversations took place not in the Kremlin offices, but on hunting trips, at dachas, and during informal meetings. The word conspiracy was not uttered. They spoke of an unhealthy situation in the leadership and the need to correct mistakes. Everyone understood what they were talking about. For such a risky undertaking to succeed, one absolutely essential guarantee was required: neutrality, or better still, the cooperation of the all-powerful KGB. Any careless move, any rumor could reach Khrushchev's personal security detail or his loyalists, and then the conspirators would face inevitable failure and severe punishment. This is where Vladimir Semichastny came into the picture. He owed his career to Shelepin and fully shared the dissatisfaction of his senior comrades. His task was not to arrest Khrushchev, but to paralyze the system that was supposed to protect him. Semichastny took personal control of the entire government communications system, the famous rotary phones. He ensured that no information about the upcoming meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee would leak to Khrushchev ahead of time. The First Secretary's security detail, the 9th Directorate of the KGB, also received tacit instructions not to interfere and to carry out orders coming from Moscow. In effect, Khrushchev, while in Pitsunda, found himself in an information vacuum, surrounded by people who had already received orders to obey the new center of power. The timing and location were ideal. His holiday in the south cut Khrushchev off from the capital and from his loyal supporters in the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers. While he was away, the conspirators in Moscow held their final consultations. Brezhnev, Nikolai Podgorny, and other members of the Presidium methodically called their colleagues to secure their support. It was a delicate psychological operation. No one wanted to be the first, but no one wanted to be late either. By the time it was decided to summon Khrushchev to Moscow, most of the country's top leadership had already agreed to his resignation. The machine had been set in motion and it was impossible to stop it. It was somewhat reminiscent of a situation at a large factory where an elderly, distinguished but unpredictable director is leading the enterprise to ruin with his decisions. And so, tired of the chaos, the workshop managers gather in the chief engineer's office and quietly, without unnecessary fuss, decide that it is time to go to the higher management with a collective statement that the director can no longer hold his position. The same thing happened here, only on the scale of a huge country. The fateful call came on the 12th of October. Nikita Sergeyevich himself picked up the phone. On the other end of the line was his protege, his loyal comrade in arms, as he considered him to be, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev's velvety baritone sounded unusually tense. He reported that urgent issues related to agriculture had arisen in Moscow that required immediate discussion by the Presidium of the Central Committee. According to eyewitness accounts, Khrushchev initially dismissed the matter. What urgent issues could there be? The harvest has been gathered. Everything is going according to plan. Let's discuss it when I get back. But Brezhnev insisted. He spoke of new ideas and the need to consult collectively. At that moment, Anastas Mikoyan, an old Bolshevik and master of political survival, was standing next to Khrushchev. He sensed something was wrong and, when Khrushchev hung up, asked directly, "Nikita, is something wrong?" Khrushchev, at first bravado, laughed it off, but the seed of doubt had already been sown. He called Moscow back and asked directly, "What's going on there? Are you plotting something against me?" Brezhnev solemnly assured him that nothing of the sort was happening, that everyone was eagerly awaiting his arrival as a beloved leader. The insincerity in his voice finally convinced Khrushchev that he was not being summoned to Moscow to discuss the harvest. The flight from Pitsunda to Moscow was filled with oppressive silence. Only Mikoyan flew with Khrushchev on the plane. The first secretary stared gloomily out of the window, replaying the latest events in his mind. He understood that he had been betrayed by those whom he himself had elevated. Mikoyan tried to cheer him up, suggesting various courses of action, appealing directly to the people, to the army, to the Moscow Party Committee. But Khrushchev was broken. He was a product of the system he himself had tried to reform. He could not imagine fighting for power outside party procedures, appealing to someone over the heads of the Central Committee. "If the party doesn't want me, I won't fight," he said bitterly. He believed that his achievements, exposing Stalin's cult of personality, the thaw, Gagarin's flight, mass housing construction, would outweigh any mistakes. He was wrong. The elite, whom he had freed from the fear of night arrests, now used that freedom to get rid of him. On the 13th of October, immediately upon his arrival in Moscow, Khrushchev went not to his home, but to the Kremlin, to a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee. The meeting room was full. The faces of his former comrades were inscrutable. No one smiled or rushed to shake his hand. The air was so electrified that it seemed you could cut it with a knife. Brezhnev opened the meeting. He did not make any accusations himself, but gave the floor to the party's chief ideologist, the Grey Cardinal Mikhail Suslov. Suslov, dry and pedantic, read out an icy, pre-prepared report. It was not an emotional outburst, but a methodical list of all Khrushchev's blunders and mistakes in recent years. The accusations came thick and fast. They reminded him of everything, not just corn and grain purchases. He was reproached for the collapse of the economy due to ill-conceived reforms and for creating a cult of personality around Khrushchev himself, which was particularly cynical given his role in de-Stalinization. Foreign policy was also blamed. The 1962 Caribbean crisis, which the West considered a moment when the world was on the brink of nuclear war, was presented as an example of dangerous adventurism. His trips abroad, his impulsive behavior, his famous shoe-throwing at the UN, all this was now interpreted as damaging to the international prestige of the USSR. The nomenclature was particularly irritated by the figure of Khrushchev's son-in-law, Alexei Adzhubey, editor-in-chief of the newspaper Izvestia. Adzhubey, a talented journalist, became the de facto unofficial foreign minister, accompanying his father-in-law on all his trips and meeting with world leaders. This was perceived as blatant nepotism, a violation of all party norms. Colleagues in the Presidium recounted stories with envy and malice about how Adzhubey met with the Pope or behaved too freely at receptions with Western capitalists. They saw this as a threat to their own position. Today, he elevated his son-in-law, but who would it be tomorrow? They also recalled his famous tirade against avant-garde artists at the Manège exhibition in 1962. At that time, Khrushchev, not mincing his words, shouted at the artists, calling their paintings daubs. This episode, which demonstrated his ignorance of art, was now presented as an example of his general tyranny and incompetence. Even his promise to build communism by 1980, which the whole country had once greeted with applause, was now held against him as irresponsible demagoguery. Khrushchev tried to defend himself. He interrupted, argued, and reminded everyone of his achievements. But no one listened to him. One after another, those who had looked at him adoringly just yesterday stood up and hurled accusations at him. Petr Shelest from Ukraine, Dmitry Polyansky, and Nikolai Podgorny spoke. The only one who tried to defend him was Mikoyan. He said that despite all the mistakes, one should not forget the main thing, the role Khrushchev played in eliminating Stalin's terror. But he was immediately cut off. The general mood was, "Thank you for the past, but in the present you are getting in our way." By the end of the second day of meetings on the 14th of October, Khrushchev was completely exhausted. He realized that the struggle was futile. The forces were unequal. In his final words, he uttered a phrase that has gone down in history. "I am old and tired. Let them manage on their own now. I have done the main thing. Could any of us have dreamed that we would be able to tell Stalin that he was not suitable for us and ask him to resign? There would have been nothing left of us. Now everything is different. Fear has disappeared and we can argue with each other on equal terms. That is my achievement." These words conveyed all the bitterness of a man who had fallen victim to the system he himself had created, where the physical destruction of opponents was no longer the norm. He signed a pre-prepared statement announcing his retirement due to health reasons and advanced age. Immediately afterwards, a plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was held. Hundreds of members of the Central Committee, gathered from all over the country, had already been processed by the conspirators. The Presidium's decision was presented to them as a fait accompli. No one dared to object. The vote was unanimous. Thus, quietly and routinely, an entire era came to an end. The next day, Soviet newspapers published a short statement on their front pages. The plenum of the Central Committee had granted Comrade Khrushchev's request to be relieved of his duties as First Secretary of the Central Committee, member of the Presidium of the Central Committee, and Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR. Brezhnev was elected as the new First Secretary and Alexei Kosygin as the head of government. The conspirators emphasized that from now on there would be collective leadership in the country to prevent a repeat of past mistakes. In reality, this marked the beginning of a long period that would later be called the Era of Stagnation. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev became a pensioner of Union significance, living out his days in a dacha near Moscow under the tacit but constant supervision of the KGB, dictating his memoirs to a tape recorder, which became his last dispute with his victorious opponents. The last straw that broke the camel's back for the nomenclature were rumors about Khrushchev's plans for the upcoming November plenum of the Central Committee. Nikita Sergeyevich, an incorrigible reformer, was going to carry out another, even more radical restructuring of the party and state apparatus. He was considering the idea of adopting a new constitution and wanted to limit the tenure of top party posts to 2 terms. For the elite, whose well-being was based on lifetime status, this was tantamount to a death sentence. They saw this as a direct threat to their stable, comfortable, and privileged existence. Moreover, Khrushchev planned to create about 120 commissions under the Central Committee, which were to control all spheres of life, from industry to culture, effectively replacing ministries and departments. This would have been a complete breakdown of the established system of government, and officials of all ranks were horrified by the prospect of such chaos. Interestingly, this was not the first attempt to remove Khrushchev. A few months before the October events, Nikolai Ignatov, a member of the Presidium of the Central Committee, tried to play his own game. In private conversations, he tested the waters, hinting at the need to restore the leadership to health. However, Ignatov acted too bluntly and carelessly. Information about his conversations reached Khrushchev, and although he did not take harsh measures, the incident served as a lesson for future conspirators. They understood that they needed to act with certainty, securing the support of an absolute majority, and most importantly, the security forces. Brezhnev and his group took Ignatov's mistakes into account. Their tactics were different. Not to agitate, but only to consult, ask leading questions, create the impression that discontent was widespread, and that the idea of Khrushchev's resignation was in the air. Brezhnev's psychological state at the moment of the fateful call to Pitsunda was extremely tense. According to his bodyguard's recollections, he hesitated for a long time before answering the phone, paced around his office, and rehearsed his lines several times. He was betraying his patron, the man who had pulled him out of provincial Dnipropetrovsk and brought him to the heights of power. But personal ambition and pressure from more decisive colleagues, such as Shelepin and Nikolai Podgorny, proved stronger than his sense of gratitude. Podgorny, first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, was one of Khrushchev's most fierce opponents. He had personally experienced all the delights of the agrarian experiments and was ready to go all the way. It was he and Shelepin who effectively pushed the indecisive Brezhnev, using him as a convenient compromise battering ram to remove the leader. In Pitsunda, the atmosphere was also changing before our eyes. Khrushchev's son, Sergei, later recalled that the day before he was summoned to Moscow, all government communication lines at the dacha suddenly fell silent, except for one direct line to Brezhnev. The security guards, usually well-trained and helpful, began to behave aloofly. Khrushchev's chief bodyguard, Colonel Litovchenko, a loyal man, was suddenly recalled to Moscow on the pretext of his wife's illness. Another officer was sent to replace him, who was cold and only carried out orders from the center. Khrushchev, an experienced apparatchik, could not fail to notice these ominous signs. When he boarded the plane, he no longer had any illusions. Upon arrival in Moscow at Vnukovo II airport, he was met not by the usual delegation with flowers and smiles, but by several gloomy figures, among whom was KGB chairman Semichastny. This was the final confirmation that he was not flying to a meeting, but to a trial. At the Presidium meeting itself, there was one episode that was both revealing and tragic for Khrushchev. Realizing that he was completely isolated, he made a desperate attempt to turn the situation around. He asked permission to call the Minister of Defense, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky. Khrushchev was confident that the army, which he had been actively rearming with missiles, would support him. A tense silence hung in the room. They brought him a telephone. Khrushchev dialed the number and, when Malinovsky answered, asked, "Rodion, I want to know the army's position. What is going on?" The marshal's answer was devastating and predetermined the outcome. He said, "Nikita Sergeyevich, the army is always with the party and the Central Committee. We do not interfere in politics and will carry out any decision of the Central Committee." For Khrushchev, that was the end. He hung up the phone and made no further attempts to fight back. He understood that he no longer held the levers of power in his hands. After the plenum voted unanimously for his resignation, Brezhnev, the new leader, did not look like a victor, according to eyewitness accounts. He approached Mikoyan, embraced him, and wept. It is difficult to say whether these were tears of relief from the tension that had been building up or belated remorse. But this moment shows the enormous psychological stress experienced by all those involved in this quiet palace coup. The next day, 15th October, the country woke up and still knew nothing. The newspapers came out with a portrait of Khrushchev on the front page, where he was presenting awards to cosmonauts Komarov, Feoktistov, and Egorov. But by evening, what would later be called erasure from history had begun. His portraits were hastily removed from all official buildings, offices, and even school classrooms. His name was deleted from books and articles being prepared for publication. Radio and television stopped quoting his speeches. The man who had been at the center of the life of a huge country for 10 years became a nobody overnight, a nameless pensioner. This sudden silence was more deafening than any accusations. The reaction around the world was mixed. Western leaders, accustomed to the eccentric but generally predictable Khrushchev, were puzzled. Who were Brezhnev and Kosygin? What could be expected of them? There was also confusion in the socialist countries. Only Chinese leader Mao Zedong, who hated Khrushchev for debunking the cult of Stalin, openly welcomed his resignation, calling it the victory of Marxism-Leninism over revisionism. The man responsible for these global changes found himself completely isolated at his dacha in Petrovodelsk. He was deprived of his Kremlin rations, most of his privileges, and, most importantly, his social life. His old friends and associates were not allowed to visit him, and his every move was monitored by KGB guards. A man of boundless energy, accustomed to being at the center of events, he found himself locked in a golden cage. For him, this was the most terrible punishment. He walked a lot and tended his garden, but his main outlet became his memoirs, which he secretly dictated onto a portable tape recorder given to him by his son. These tapes, secretly taken to the West and published there, became his last word. his response to those who so easily erased him from history. In them, he acknowledged his mistakes, but to the end he defended the main cause of his life, de-Stalinization, which, as he said at that last meeting for him, freed the party from animal fear and ultimately made his own bloodless removal possible. This was the main irony of his fate. When the doors of the meeting room closed behind the deposed leader, there was no sense of relief in the Kremlin, but rather an awkward, expectant silence. The victors, not yet fully aware of the scale of what they had done, began to divide up the power. This process was no less important than the conspiracy itself. A key difference immediately emerged between Brezhnev and his ambitious colleagues, primarily Shelepin. Iron Shurik and his Komsomol group had hoped for much more, but the old guard, represented by Suslov and Kosygin, instinctively feared their energy and radicalism. Therefore, power was carefully divided. Brezhnev got the highest party post as the safest and most predictable candidate, while the country's economy, the Council of Ministers, was given to Alexei Kosygin, a gloomy, competent technocrat who was the complete opposite of both Khrushchev and Brezhnev. It was an unspoken pact. Party apparatchiks would gain ideological control and stability, while economists would be able to work in peace without any more brilliant ideas from above. Paradoxically, Khrushchev himself created the precedent that was supposed to save him but ultimately destroyed him. In 1957, the so-called anti-party group, Molotov, Malenkov, and Kaganovich, old Stalinist comrades, turned against him. With a majority in the Presidium of the Central Committee, they tried to remove him in the same way. But then Khrushchev showed remarkable cunning. He declared that the Presidium had no right to decide the fate of the first secretary, who had been elected by the plenum of the Central Committee. With the support of the Minister of Defense, Marshal Zhukov, he managed to convene an emergency plenum. Zhukov ordered the military aviation to fly members of the Central Committee from all corners of the country to Moscow. Most of them were Khrushchev's protégés, and they, of course, supported their patron, condemning the factionalists. The conspirators of 1964, and Shelepin in particular, had learned this lesson well. They understood that without the support of the plenum of the Central Committee, their venture was doomed. Therefore, several months before the coup, they worked painstakingly to win over the secretaries of the regional committees and the Central Committee of the Union Republics, promising them the most important thing: personnel stability. This was a magic phrase that meant an end to constant reshuffles, divisions, and reorganizations. In fact, they had secured the support of the very body that had saved Khrushchev in 1957. When he realized what was happening, there was no one left to appeal to. He himself contributed to his downfall by displaying a striking blindness to the mood around him. Shortly before the fateful events, in a conversation with Mikoyan, he spoke disparagingly about his colleagues in the Presidium, saying that he could take them down like puppies. He had no sense that these puppies had already turned into a pack of wolves. He particularly underestimated Brezhnev, whom he considered a soft, indecisive, and absolutely loyal man. His response to some warnings has been preserved. What kind of conspirator is Leonid? He's so kind he wouldn't hurt a fly. This blind confidence in his own indispensability and in the loyalty of those around him became his Achilles' heel. He was used to getting away with everything and missed the moment when the number of dissatisfied people turned into quality. The silence that enveloped the country after Khrushchev's resignation was not only a sign of fear or indifference. For many ordinary people, especially in cities, the last years of his rule were associated with very real, everyday difficulties. For the first time since the war, there were shortages of bread and flour in shops, and prices for meat and butter rose. Endless reforms and promises of the imminent advent of communism did not sit well with empty shop shelves. Therefore, many people reacted to the news of his resignation, if not with joy, then with quiet hope that now there will be order. The new leadership subtly picked up on these sentiments. One of the first steps taken by Brezhnev and Kosygin was to abolish the unpopular division of party committees and increase investment in agriculture and light industry. This was a direct response to the main complaints against Khrushchev, and it secured the new leader's silent support from below. People were tired of revolutionary leaps and simply wanted a peaceful, well-fed life. Brezhnev, with his promise of stability, seemed to be the one who could provide it. Thus, the quiet conspiracy of the elite received the tacit approval of a society tired of change. Anastas Mikoyan, a master of political survival, tried until the very end to find a compromise solution. It was he who proposed dividing the posts, leaving Khrushchev as chairman of the Council of Ministers and transferring party leadership to Brezhnev. But this proposal was decisively rejected. The conspirators wanted complete and unconditional surrender. Interestingly, according to some accounts, the initial plan did not envisage complete removal from office. The more moderate members of the Presidium wanted only to severely criticize Khrushchev, force him to publicly repent of his mistakes, and agree to real collective leadership. However, Nikita Sergeyevich's proud and unyielding character, his attempts to snap back and argue during the meeting, made such an outcome impossible. The avalanche of criticism that fell upon him took on its own inexorable logic. The tragedy of the situation is compounded by the fact that Khrushchev's son, Sergei, who worked in the rocket industry, heard alarming rumors in Moscow and desperately tried to call his father in Pitsunda to warn him of the danger. But all his attempts were in vain. The special communications were already under Semichastny's complete control. The apogee of the new regime's cynicism was the subsequent fate of the main organizers. Leonid Brezhnev, having consolidated his power, methodically and cold-bloodedly got rid of his overly active comrades in arms. The first victim was Iron Shurik Shelepin, whose excessive ambitions frightened the new general secretary. Brezhnev understood perfectly well that someone who had once helped organize a conspiracy could easily do so again. Thus began the era of stability, with the quiet elimination of those who had brought it about. Khrushchev's removal was a turning point in the history of the USSR, showing that power could change through the intrigues of the elite without open violence. This conspiracy not only led to the Brezhnev era and subsequent stagnation, but also demonstrated the fragility of leadership in a totalitarian system. Remembering these events, we can better understand the mechanisms of power and the lessons of